Welcome to the Digital Photo Academy Library. In today's class, we're going to talk about crucial compositional techniques that you want to master in order to make great photographs. Each section in itself has a lot of information, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but the trick is make some notes, watch one section, go out and practice, come back and watch some more, make some notes, keep practicing, practice, practice, practice. Not only is that how you get to Carnegie Hall, as the old joke says, but that's also how you become a better photographer. One of the most basic lessons in all photography is called the rule of thirds. And the idea behind the rule of thirds is you look at the screen, imagine breaking an image down into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, so you have 9 parts or 9 small boxes. With this grid in mind, the rule of thirds identifies 4 important points in the image you should consider when you're placing the points of interest as your frame or image. Not only this, but it also gives you 4 lines that are also used for positioning the various elements in your photographs. You can either use those 4 points as places to put the important part of your image, or use them as ways to remind yourself to divide your image and to not dead center your primary subject. And what I use the rule of thirds for the most is not having that thing that I'm photographing, the person, the place, the flower, the food, not in the center. There's a reason photographers use the expression dead center, because when you put something in the center, it tends to be static or dead. So the rule of thirds is great because if you apply it and you have that in the back of your head, you're always saying to yourself, no, let's try the right side, let's try the left. And if you divide your frame, as it shows on the screen here, into those 9 little boxes, those 4 points with the red marks, those are the points where you want to try to have your main activity, because if you have to the right or the left, it gives your photograph more energy and a feeling of movement from one part to the other. One way to think about the rule of thirds is, as you're taking your image, imagine that grid that we just described is inside your viewfinder or on the LCD display that's on the back of your camera. This again applies, the rule of thirds will apply whether or not you're using a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. One technology or the other, one is not better than the other. Both of them will be very functional if you use the rule of thirds, but the idea is dividing your frame up that way. Some cameras actually offer you the option of putting the rule of thirds on your screen as grids or lines. And if you have that option, it's really something to have turned on all the time and use it as a guidepost. So here, for example, a few of my images made with mirrorless cameras, showing you how I'm using the rule of thirds in vertical images. The one on the left is from Brazil, and the idea is that 1/3 of the image, where the activity is taking place, is at the bottom, and 2/3, which is the mountain in the background, are the upper part of the image. The image on the right is at a farmer's market in Rhode Island, and I've got this beautiful eggplant on the right, and the eggplant's in the foreground, and the woman selling it is in the background. And in both of these images, had I put the main subject dead in the center, the image would be very static. But that rule of thirds, which I use all the time subconsciously, reminds me to put one thing at the bottom, or the top, or the left or the right, but not in the middle, and then have the secondary part of the scene filling up the rest of the frame. And so there's some example of using the rule of thirds when you're doing verticals. So why am I so obsessed about the rule of thirds? If you follow the rule of thirds, it'll help your photos become more balanced, and it'll enable the viewer to interact with the different components of your images more naturally. Studies that they've made show that when viewing images, people's eyes usually go to one of those intersection points that I just diagrammed on the rule of thirds. They go to those naturally rather than the center. If you use the rule of thirds, it's a good way to get the viewer to go through the image rather than going right to the center and then leaving. Because our job as photographers is to draw the viewer in, take them through the different parts of the image, and give them an experience or a narrative, and that's what the best photographs do. So here's some more photographs to highlight that rule of thirds. In this case, the photograph by Frank Siteman, a Digital Photo Academy instructor in Boston. And here he's using contrast, and by that I mean the dog who's dominant on the left third separates out from the rest of the scene, which is out of focus, in the background on the right 2/3. And so the idea here with the rule of thirds is that your eye goes to the dog first, because that's the dominant third of the frame, and then it goes to the other part of the frame second. And that's what we do as photographers. We keep the eye of the viewers moving from one part of the image to the next. Another image by Frank Siteman. This is a classical portrait in the sense that you don't want to put the person right in the dead center. If you'll notice, this young girl, her upper torso is in the left third of the frame, and the right 2/3 of the frame are empty and they're out of focus. That out of focus background, it works really well to start me to look at her first, to go to her eyes first, and then move from the left with her face to the right of the frame with that out of focus background. That rule of third applies whether you're doing horizontals or verticals, people, landscapes. Here's a couple more Frank's photos made with the DSLR. Portraits, same subject, very different approaches. But in both cases, you'll notice the primary activity center, which is her eyes, is in the upper 2/3 point, right at that point on that grid of the imaginary grid that he would draw in his frame of 2 vertical lines, 2 horizontal lines, and you have those 4 points. On the right image, her eyes are right at those points. In the left image, largely the same thing. The bottom 2/3 of both images support the story, but the primary thing is that the eyes are actually not dead centered, and so we go to her first and then slowly work our way around the rest of the image, in both cases, left or right. And though Frank's photos are made with DSLRs and mine are made with mirrorless cameras, the techniques that I'm talking about when you're doing this rule of thirds application in terms of composing your image, it applies equally for DSLRs and for mirrorless cameras. Both of them are going to give you the same quality result as long as you pay attention to that idea of the rule of thirds. Here's another one of Frank's photographs. And what makes this work, to me at least, is he didn't put the main subject dead center. The dog's kind of centered, but the child is not centered. The child's actually in the lower third, the dog is in the right third, and together those two parts of the story moves the viewer's eyes from the kid to the dog to the background. Another 2 of Frank's photographs. They're obviously completely different. One's a still life, one's people, but if you look, he's used that same idea of not dead centering the primary point of activity. The photograph of the 2 people on the right, if you were to draw those lines for the rule of thirds, you'll notice that he has each of the 2 subjects on those lines, those imaginary axes, and then on the photograph on the left, where the flower is and where the tomato is, they're not centered. Again, they're matching the lines and those points of attention if you draw the 2 lines vertically and the 2 lines horizontally to create the grid. And so he's very effectively using the rule of thirds to keep our attention moving around in the image. This is one of my photos made with a mirrorless camera. 1/3 of the image is the people in the foreground, 2/3 is the rest of the train station in the background. And I do a lot of things like this where I'm not going to put everything dead centered, but I'm going to have 1/3, say, at the bottom or the top, and then 2/3, the remaining part of the image, to be something else. Again, trying to follow that idea of the rule of thirds. This is a Brooklyn Bridge under reconstruction in New York City, made with a mirrorless camera. And the idea, the way to really make this image static and uninteresting would be to put the subject in the main center by having him over to the left on that idea of that left third of the image, make him dominant, and the lines of the scaffolding and the lines of the repair lines receding off in the background to the right. That creates the narrative that tells the viewer, start by looking here and then move to the right part of the image. A photograph of fishermen in Guatemala. 1/3 of the frame is the fisherman in the foreground who's in focus. 2/3 of the frame is the out of focus mountain behind him. And again, had I made it dead centered, it would have been much more static. And so I'm always thinking, try not to have things right in the center. Keep them a little right, keep them a little left, with that idea of the rule of thirds dividing up the frame. Another photograph, this case in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And so if you think about the rule of thirds, I actually have it divided almost perfectly in thirds. The boats in the foreground are one line, the larger boats in the background are the other line, and so you have a third sky, a third the water in the middle, and then a third water in the foreground. And so that creates a story where the viewer starts close, medium, and far. And the rule of thirds, like all these other compositional techniques, does one thing. It enables you to construct an image that's more interesting than just straight on dead center, to create a narrative within your photographs that tells the viewer, this is where I want you to start, this is the next part of the story, this is the next part of the story. Okay, so now you have a better understanding of the very, very important compositional technique called the rule of thirds. We're going to run you through a little slideshow here and show you the same photographs again. Don't be afraid to pause the recording and look at them and actually say to yourself, well, where is that 1/3 line? And if you really want to learn, believe it or not, take a piece of paper or a Post-it note or something, put it on the screen of your computer and see where those lines are, and you'll start to understand how having those rule of thirds subconsciously guiding the photographer will help the photographer make better images. And if you look at those images in the slideshow we're about to show you, and you break it down, and you actually pay attention to that, you make some notes, then you go out and make photographs applying those, you will eventually internalize the rule of thirds. And trust me on this one, your photographs from now on will be that much better because you're always going to be saying to yourself, use those imaginary lines, move the composition from dead center to those points of activity to make the photographs more interesting and more compelling. So now I'm in the middle of Washington Square Park in the heart of New York City. There's a lot of different things to photograph here, and I'm just looking around. And one of the things you actually want to do as a lesson as a photographer is you sometimes have to say to yourself, I don't want to get overwhelmed by all this stimulus. I'm actually going to stop and concentrate on one thing. And so for me today, I'm going to stop and concentrate on one thing. I'm going to concentrate on the rule of thirds, this idea of dividing the frame with 3 lines vertically and 3 lines horizontally to create a grid, to use that grid as a way of getting the main points of attention in your images not dead centered. So I'm going to find a few situations here where I'm going to do compositions where I'll probably show you the bad version with the scene dead centered, and then I'll make another version using the rule of thirds to give you that idea of how those rule of thirds will make the framing and the composition more interesting. So my first thought is that this doesn't look very interesting because that lamp is dead centered, which is not good. So I'm going to move over here, and then I'm going to step back a little bit. And now it's getting more interesting because I have one piece of lamp, or one of the lamps to the left, and the other building is to the right. And so I have 2 parts of the scene, and neither of them is dead centered. One is to the right a third, one is to the left a third. And that's just one example of how you might use the idea of the rule of thirds. So I'm going to take a couple pictures, and then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to walk over to the other side and see if this scene looks any better from over here, which it does. So I'm going to do this. Check that. So the next thing that caught my eye was this fountain. It's hot. I want to go in the water, but I'm not going to go in the water. But I might get a little wet as I creep up to the edge. The first thing most people would do wrong with the photograph of this is they're going to typically put the fountain right in the middle of the image. And that's something I'm not going to do. My first thought might be to have the fountain to the right side of the image and maybe the smaller feeder fountain to the left, and then maybe some of the far fountains as well. So I'm going to go try to put that together using different relationships and spaces. So what I've got here is I've got one fountain is to the right, and then the feeder fountain's kind of to the left, and I'm just going to wait for the kids to come through and make a frame or 2 right there when they fill in that middle spot. Let's see if they're going to come over here again. So at this point in time, what I'm looking at is that the left third of my viewfinder is the close fountain, and the far third of my viewfinder is the main fountain. And then I'm just going to wait for a kid to appear against that bright spot of the fountain over there, and that'll be my picture. So then I just have to wait a little bit more till I get a kid against the bright part of the fountain right over there, which is just about to happen, I think, maybe not. Kids coming across, kids walk in front, right there, 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 there. That's exactly what I want. Cool. So I cooled off on the fountain, which was very nice. And the other big landmark here at Washington Square Park, not surprisingly, is the arch. So I'm going to walk over and I'm going to try to make some photos of the arch. I walked over here and the first thing that caught my eye was the Empire State Building, which you can see the Empire State Building through the arch. So right off the top, I'm going to try to make something using the Empire State Building framed by that arch. That's my very first starting point. See if I can make that work. So at this point in time, you only see the Empire State Building, which isn't all that interesting. But when I get back to about here, now I've got the archway, which gives it some reference point to locate it. So in this case, the arch is on the rule of thirds to the right and to the left, but the Empire State Building is actually kind of dead centered. But the archway does a nice job of driving the viewer's attention from the arch to the Empire State Building. I'm going to do a really tight version, which I have right here, where 1/3 of the frame is the old buildings to the left, and 1/3 of the frame is the Empire State Building to the right. And there's nothing but space in between in the quote-unquote dead center. But that idea of dividing the frame up into thirds is what makes this image so interesting. Going to back my zoom up a little bit to include a little bit more arch as well. So now I'm giving you some examples of the idea of rule of thirds, and I've shown you a couple things that you might want to photograph. You want to find some other things as well here in Washington Square Park. Beautiful place, a lot of activity, a lot of people running around, a lot of different things to photograph. So it's your turn now. Go out and make some photographs. Keep in mind that idea of rule of thirds. Don't be afraid to put yourself through the actual exercise of putting your main subject in the middle and then move it to the left and move it to the right. Take all those pictures, and then later you can look at them and you can actually say, you know, he was right, that guy. He's pretty smart. That it looked better when it was off the center to the right or to the left.